Hello there, it's Daniel Bridge. I promised to do a video on these things, flash guns. So I'm going to talk through a couple of different, well, a few of the different features, many of the different features, all the different features, but maybe not all the different features, but lots of different features with flash guns and the different things that you can do with them. We'll go through section by section, and hopefully this will get you understanding a little bit more about what these things can do. So first off, the actual structure of this thing. So it fits on the hot shoe on the top of the camera, and most of them will have a little switch or a little screw type thing that will hold the flash gun in place. Often there's a little pin that comes out and locks it there. So if you can't get that off the camera for some reason, make sure you have actually unlocked that. Otherwise it's not going anywhere. They will come in different sizes. This is a reasonably chunky one, if you like, and those different sizes allow it to have different features. So for instance, on here we've got what's called a bounce and swivel head. So pushing the little bit in at the side there will allow us to flip the flash upwards, so it's then going to be firing up towards the ceiling. Pop it back down again, even tips slightly lower down as well, and it will rotate too. So we can change where it's pointing depending on what we want that flash to be doing. The reason we might want to point it up at the ceiling is because then that light is going up to bounce off the ceiling, coming back down to your subject, and that means that the lighting can be a lot softer and less harsh than it would be if the light is pointing straight at your subject. And if you've got the camera in a portrait format and you're shooting like that, you can still do that by bouncing that off of there. It's then going back up to the ceiling again. Not all flashes will do that. Some will just have the bounce function, they won't swivel. Others will be entirely fixed and they won't swivel from side to side either, or bounce at all. In general, you can get lots of different flash guns like this that will allow you to have this bounce and swivel functionality. Most of them have a screen on the back, or at least some way of setting some settings and various different buttons, which we'll go through in a bit. This one's got an LED on the front. Some will have extra little flashes and things like that, and these allow either aids for focusing, so if it's dim light, we might get a bit of extra light coming out of that to help the camera to focus, but it can also be as a fill-in flash. So if you've got your flash pointing upwards like this, we can project a bit of light straight towards the subject as well to put catch lights in eyes and lift shadows and things like that. Flashes often or usually have a zoom function as well, and what that does is changes the angle that the flash spreads out at. As a default, it's going to be covering a reasonably wide area, but we can narrow that beam, so it will come narrower and narrower beam, project that flash further and further forward as well. It might be that we're using a longer focal length. Maybe we've zoomed into 85mm, and we don't need that flash to be covering the whole scene that's in front of us. We only need the width that we're going to be seeing actually with this lens. So we can zoom this lens. Now, so how it happens is we look at this bit on here. We would see that little flash head in there, kind of pulling back more, and it focuses the beam where we're telling it to. We usually also have a little pull-out diffuser like that, which spreads the light out further. So if you're using a particularly wide-angle lens and you're getting light fall off, so it's dark around the edges because the flash isn't covering that whole area, you can pull out this little cover, and that will help to spread that light out further still. The flashes we have will in general be auto exposure. You can get manual flash guns, but let's, for the sake of argument, we're using an auto exposure one, and we'll have terms like PTTL, ITTL, ETTL, can't think of any others, but that sort of thing. The TTL stands for through the lens, and that means that the flash fires and the camera measures the light that's coming back through the lens. And in fact, it's doing two flashes. It's generally, they're so close together that we can't see them. But that first flash is purely used to set up the exposure. That first flash is reflected back off the subject. It comes in through the lens, the TTL. The camera measures what that exposure is like, and then it can tell the flash exactly how much power it needs to put out in order to give us a correct exposure. So that's one option, PTTL or TTL. And with these, they're auto exposures, so the camera's measuring the light that's coming back and it's setting an exposure. And we can then control what that exposure is like by using flash exposure compensation. That's either something you do on the flash itself. So here, for instance, if we can see that on there, I can use so this little thing flashing away there. I can use positive or negative flash exposure compensation. That's going to brighten the flash up or darken it down. Darkening it down means that we can use the flash for fill-in flash. So it's not the pure light source, it's not the sole light source, but it's adding in light to our subject, and it can raise the shadows under chins, put little catch lights in eyes and things like that, especially if you're shooting outside on a sunny day. So that's the TTL option, the auto exposure option, but we'll also have a manual exposure option. So on here, for instance, now it's saying M as opposed to before it said PTTL. And with manual exposure, we now have absolute control over how much light this flash emits. It will put out a certain amount of light, and how much light that is again down to us. We can control that. And we would now have something like this here, where we can change the power output of that flash. There we go. So here I'm changing it down to fractions of an amount. It goes all the way down on here to 256th, and the maximum we can have is 1:1. So the flash is able to put out a certain amount of light. You will find that there's a thing called a guide number for flashes, and it might go from something like 36 to 48 to 54 or higher or lower, depending on the ultimate power that the flash can put out. The higher that number, the greater the intensity of light that the flash can put out in one go. So with this, we're telling the flash how much light to put out. If it's 1:1, 1/1, then it's the full amount of flash that it can, full power. And as we reduce that amount, go to a half, quarter, eighth, and so on, we're reducing the output of the light. And that means we can perhaps balance it better with natural light, or create the look that we're after, or get the exposure right ultimately. So another way of using the flash is to have the flash off the camera rather than mounted on the hot shoe. And then we'd need to be using it wirelessly. And there are a few different ways that we can do that. So on here we can see now that it's got a little W on there, which shows that it's into wireless mode now. So it's still auto exposure, or I can use it in manual exposure and wireless too. So we could use a flash on the camera to trigger the flash gun. So we'd have the flash gun somewhere remote. It could be right next to the camera, but it could be the other end of the garden, like I was doing on a video recently. And we need a flash on the camera to trigger that. So I can use a pop-up flash on my camera, and that will trigger the flash gun, or a flash gun on the camera and a separate one as well. It really depends on whether your camera can trigger an external flash gun that's off the camera by using the pop-up flash. Some can, some can't. Your camera might not have a pop-up flash, in which case you definitely need a second flash gun. We could use a radio wireless trigger. What that is we'd have a receiver on the bottom of the flash gun. So the hot shoe would, the receiver would have a hot shoe, the flash would mount on that, and then we'd have a trigger or transmitter on the camera. And when you take a photo, the transmitter or that trigger sends a signal to the receiver, and that will trigger your flash gun. But it might be you've also got a flash gun that actually communicates directly with a camera. Some of them do that, or directly with a trigger, so it might have that receiver built in. So it really depends on the system that you've got. If you're lucky and you don't need to use it too often, then perhaps a pop-up flash, triggering the flash gun is probably the easier or cheaper option, but for more flexibility you really want some way of triggering that flash gun, perhaps using the radio triggers, because it means that you don't need a line of sight. With my camera, when I'm using the pop-up flash, this needs to be able to see the flash. Whereas if it's a radio trigger, this could be hidden behind a tree or around the corner of a wall or something like that. It perhaps wouldn't be able to see the flash from the camera, but the radio trigger would still work and trigger that flash. So that's wireless options. And again, you could use TTL or manual exposure with those. Cameras generally have a flash synchronization speed, and that is the fastest shutter speed you can use and still get the flashlight covering the whole of the sensor. So when you're taking a photo, let's pop that down for a moment, you've got 2 shutters inside your camera. When you take a photo, that first shutter opens, light falls onto the sensor, and then the second shutter comes up to finish off that exposure, and then they'll recock and then they're ready to go again. Flash synchronization speed is the fastest speed that that first shutter has completely cleared the sensor before the second one is coming up. So that completely clears it, the flash fires, and then the second one comes up and closes that exposure off. Faster than that flash synchronization speed, that first shutter hasn't cleared the sensor before the second one's chasing it across. So if your shutter speed goes all the way up to, say, 4,000th of a second or 8,000th of a second, something like that, actually what's happening is that first shutter starts to open, but the second one chases it across, and you just get this thin strip of sensor that's been exposed at any one time. If you fired the flash then, you would just get a thin strip of sensor exposed, and the rest of it would be very dark. So lots of cameras, lots of flash guns allow us to use what's called high-speed synchronization. And what that does is, rather than doing this instantaneous flash, actually changes the flash gun so it's putting out a small continuous burst of light. And that means that as that slit of the sensor is exposed, there's light reaching that sensor all the time from the flash gun. We need to set that on the camera. There would be a setting in your flash settings to enable high-speed synchronization. And the flash gun should really recognize that you're doing that. And that would allow you to use these much faster shutter speeds. It does reduce the output of the flash, so it's not as bright and not as powerful as it potentially could be with an instantaneous flash. But it does mean that we can mix it better with sunlight. If you're outside on a sunny day and you're getting a shot where your shutter speed is 1,000th of a second, you want to use flash. If you haven't got high-speed flash and your shutter speed then comes down to, say, 200th of a second, you may well find that you're overexposing your shot because there's simply too much of the sunlight coming in. So we can use the ambient light, the sunlight, and we can use the flashlight. We can use the flash exposure compensation to reduce the power of the output of the flash, which then means that it's just adding in a bit of extra light, lighting up shadows under chins, putting catch lights in eyes, things like that. And we can balance that better with the brighter ambient light that we might have. And also using lower aperture values, those bigger apertures that let more light in and give us shallower depth of field. If you're doing a portrait, you might want to be using this faster shutter speed. So something with a high speed synchronization is really useful. You're not going to be using it all the time, because a lot of the time perhaps you're using that flash to light indoor scenes, but when you've got these outdoor photos and that light is brighter, high-speed synchronization can be really useful. And finally, we can control when during the exposure this flash fires. Does it fire at the start of the exposure? Does it fire at the end of the exposure? And that might not necessarily seem that important, but when there's movement in a scene and we have a slower shutter speed, that can really quite significantly affect how these shots look. Looking either on the flash gun or probably more so on the camera in the flash settings, you would see this thing called either first curtain synchronization, trailing shutter, or various different things. First curtain synchronization is when the flash fires at the start of the exposure. When we're thinking about that shutter again, we've got a shutter that opens, second one that comes up. This is your first curtain, this is your trailing, your second curtain. So with the first curtain setting, the flash fires at the start of the exposure and then however long that exposure is, the shutter then, second one comes up and closes that exposure off. For general exposures, that's going to be absolutely fine. But if we've got a longer exposure and this movement that might be there, and imagine my hand moving across this image when I'm taking a shot. And let's say it takes a second to do this exposure. I'm shooting in dimmer light and we are going to get some blurring of this subject as it's moving through the frame. If the flash fires at the start of the exposure, we will get a nice crisp image when the or crisp image of the subject when it's over here, and then it will continue to move and it will blur. Imagine if that's someone on a bike. Someone on a bike riding past, you'll get a nice crisp image of them here, and then the blur that comes out in front of them, which would give us the impression that that bike was going backwards. So instead we can have that flash firing at the end of the exposure, the trailing curtain or the second curtain synchronization setting, and that means that when the flash fires, it's at the just before the shutter closes again. So this subject will move across here, and then when it's over here at the end of the exposure, that's when the flash fires. So we'll have a crisp subject here, and we'll get that blurring coming out from behind it, and it looks a lot more natural. It looks more how we might expect it to be. So second curtain synchronization, that trailing curtain synchronization, allows us to have the flash firing at the end of the exposure, and if there is blurring, it will trail out behind the movement and will look more natural. So there you go, that's my rundown through the various settings you'll find on most flash guns. And the sort of situations where you might want to be using those. But if you've got any questions, then please put them in the comments or drop me a line. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, via my website, all sorts of places. Send me a comment, ask me a question, give me a like if you've enjoyed this and found this useful, and please make sure you subscribe, because I will be putting more videos on, and hopefully you'll find those useful too. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again.